What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. Since 2008, we've been bringing you some of the best thinkers in the academy, be they scholars of religion, theology, ethics, biblical studies, scientists, philosophers, and more. Well, today on the podcast, you get to meet Reggie Williams. That's right. Reggie Williams is a theological ethicist from North Park Seminary in Chicago, and the author of Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, Harlem Renaissance Theology, and an Ethic of Resistance. This was recorded live as part of the Rise of Bonhoeffer online reading group. Yeah, and you can go to riseofbonhoeffer.com and join right now. Reggie joined to talk about his book, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, and we tackle a host of other timely topics. It was a blast. So check it out. You're going to have some fun, and then you're going to say, I should join the Rise of Bonhoeffer reading group. So just go to riseofbonhoeffer.com. Get on it, because Jeffrey C. Pugh and I have been having some fun, and we have some other special guests heading their way to this reading group. Anyway, before we jump in, I want to give everyone here a chance to give a hand to the brand new members of the Homebrewed Christianity community. That's right. Gail, Thomas, Nancy, Maria, Charles, Kyle, all brand new members, the elect, the elite, the zesty members of the Homebrewed community. They went to homebrewedcommunity.com. They signed up. They joined. They got access to the private Facebook group, and most exciting element. What is it? Ooh, yes, the Homebrewed community podcast feed. It is a whole podcast feed just for members. Yeah, with over 50 different extra sessions already in it. More are arriving each month. Like, not only is everything for the Rise of Bonhoeffer class showing up in that podcast feed, so you don't have to put any work into downloading and getting access to it, but also there is an intro to Jürgen Moltmann lecture put in there that I did with my friend Scott Paith. And Philip Clayton and I walk through Moltmann's epic and legendary text, The Crucified God. Yeah, you can get that along with the introduction to the Old Testament with Walter Brueggemann, Process and Reality with John Cobb. You can get my theological stand-up lecture on panpsychism, an introduction to Pannenberg, a theology of culture with Jack Caputo. There's tons of exciting things in there. All right? So go to Homebrewed Community, and you too can be as cool as Gail, Thomas, Nancy, Maria, Charles, and Kyle. Oh yeah, so now, here we go. This is Reggie Williams, Jeffrey C. Pugh, talking about Dr. Williams' amazing book, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. Well, hello, everybody. This is Trip, and Jeffrey C. Pugh is on his anniversary and has rigged up internet because he's like, you can't hang out with Reggie by yourself. And so what brings a theologian out on their anniversary to get on Facebook and talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer? The one and only Dr. Reggie Williams. So thank you both for being here.
Well, I'm hugely honored, and good to see my friend Jeff again. Happy anniversary, Jeff.
Thanks, man.
Oh yeah. So maybe the place to begin is for us to hear a little bit about yourself and share maybe how your own vocation of theological ethics emerged in your life and how that led to connecting with Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on your podcast. And on live on Facebook. So I'm a Christian social ethicist. I'm ordained in Progressive National Baptist Church. And I do work related to aesthetics, Black life, Black church. I was initially interested in practical theology because I thought it was ethics. That's a master's student thinking. And when I entered into a program in ethics as a result of Glenn Stassen at Fuller, I learned that this is what I was intending to do. This is what I was really wanting to do. And Glenn was very much, I should say he was very much influenced by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he made a number of Bonhoeffer scholars, including myself. But we do this work, Glenn did this work as an ethicist, as somebody who is interested in recognizing the way life choices and people are shaped by our convictions, by our faith. So my work with Dietrich Bonhoeffer is related to that. More specifically about Glenn, he was interested in the way that Bonhoeffer became one of the early people to recognize that the Nazis were a problem. Very early in Bonhoeffer's career, he recognized that the Nazis were a problem for Germany before others did. And for Glenn, that recognition came from time that Bonhoeffer spent in New York. He located Bonhoeffer's transformation, or I should say his metanoia, his what did he call it? This faith development in Bonhoeffer's life related to a time that Bonhoeffer spent at Abyssinian Baptist. We had some talk about it. I had done some work on my master's program on theology and art. And in that art class, I did a study of the Harlem Renaissance, in particular of one particular artist, Aaron Douglas. So when I was studying with Glenn a year or two later, actually in a PhD program, I recognized at the time period that he said that Bonhoeffer was in New York also corresponded with the Harlem Renaissance. And I wondered if there was any correspondence. I should say if there was any impact on him. And come to find out, there was a lot. He was talking a lot about it. And there was hardly anything in print about his time in New York at that moment and all of the reading that he was doing about that. So he wasn't just at Abyssinian, I learned. He was at Abyssinian during the Harlem Renaissance, which is a watershed moment in Black history. And so you have to put both of those together when you talk about what happened to him in New York. That's how that all came about. That particular research came about. I'm still doing work on the Harlem Renaissance, in particular as it relates to social ethics.
Is the so the book itself, you talked about your time with Glenn Stassen and coming out of his own kind of sparking the research interest. How would you depict the questions that Bonhoeffer, or how would you describe the questions Bonhoeffer carried with him to New York at that moment in his life, and kind of based on his first dissertations, and what changed when he got there? Like, what was he expecting that he didn't find, and then what were some of the experiences that shaped him in his time in New York?
Yeah, well, in the 1970s, an American Bonhoeffer scholar named Ruth Zerner did a major essay where she said, in response to a conversation that was being had amongst Bonhoeffer scholars about a letter that he wrote in 1944 to his friend Eberhard Bethge. He writes this letter where he says, I don't think I've changed much in my life, with the exception of my first trip abroad and under the influence of Father's personality. His father was a really strong, I guess, autocratic person at home. But this conversation was about where that change happened. Many people were saying it was Germany. I should say it was Europe. And others were saying, like Ruth, it was in the United States. Now, what was it that changed? She said that he was looking for a community that put their entire life under the gospel. That you didn't have this two-kingdom split, you didn't have this compartmentalization, and so forth. And he came to the United States looking for something like that. What's a good picture of a faith community that isn't split between public and private life? And in the 90s, another scholar named Hans Pfeiffer, this time a German scholar, said that he was talking about New York because of the condition of his life before he went. He says Bonhoeffer was not fulfilled with a life as a theologian. And it was something along the lines of, is there any relevance to the faith beyond a bourgeois church in a compartmentalized life between that the theologian lives, something along those lines. Eberhard Bethge, his best friend, looking at some essays that, or I should say some lectures that Bonhoeffer gave when he was an assistant pastor to an expatriate congregation of Germans in Barcelona, Spain in 1929, that Bonhoeffer needed further developments in his understanding of Luther's theology of the cross. There are several kinds of things. The theology of the cross is something we can dig in. We may or may not want to dig into that, but there were several things related to his faith and its sincerity for him as a Christian.
So you allude to this moment, and it's as far as I know, there's no accounting of it anywhere that is detailed, but there is that moment where Bonhoeffer says he kind of became a Christian, so to speak, that he moved from the academy to and this happens post Abyssinian.
Right.
And he has these conversations with people. You also in your book talk about the conversations you have with Miles Horton.
Yes.
After he preaches one day at Abyssinian. And I guess the thinking that anybody reading your book would have is that Bonhoeffer would have never had that transformative moment without his time in Harlem, without his time at Abyssinian. That in fact is what transformed his internal world to become, he says, I became a Christian, and to take Scripture in a vastly different way.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think that's right. Now, the book was published in 2014. I've continued to do a lot of research, and I still stand by that. I think that's right. He, you and I both know, Jeffrey, that the former love interest that he's writing to in that essay, that letter, where he says that he hadn't yet become a Christian, that he was using the Bible or theology for his own selfish interests. He's brilliant kid.
Yeah.
When he writes his dissertation. He's a brilliant guy.
Yeah, he is.
He doesn't want to be under the leadership of any one particular professor at the University of Berlin. And he's reading Barth, and he makes something, a theological contribution to the Christian concept of personhood that his professors at the University of Berlin, some would say that they didn't really understand it. The complexity of it all. But he doesn't become pious, doesn't take faith seriously for himself, or even start really attending church very much until after New York. This is what happens with him. And Miles Horton, who was a co-founder of the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, the place that trained Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Ralph Abernathy, these people for the civil rights movement. Miles Horton was a student along with Bonhoeffer at Union Seminary, along with Jim Dombrowski, the co-founder. Miles meets Bonhoeffer in the lobby of student housing after Bonhoeffer came back from attending church there at Union. And he was, as Miles says, uncharacteristically emotional.
Yeah.
He was really excited, talking about service that morning. And Miles said, I think I saw something that led to his death at the hand of the Nazis on that morning.
Wow.
Yeah. His excitement by identifying with Church of the Outcasts in the United States.
So in some ways, I don't mean to shorten this too much, and I'm not making light here, but without the Black Jesus, we would not have had Bonhoeffer.
Yeah, I wonder. Now, I wonder if I would say it like that. Here's the thing. Nobody else in his family supported the Nazis either, and they didn't come to the States, with the exception of a cousin that came a couple of years after him. And he had a brother who was also assassinated, who was killed by the Nazis.
Right.
As you know. The only brother who survived Well, he had a brother who survived the whole thing, both World War I and World War II, whom you know, called Friedrich. But what was it? I think two things happened here. One, I think he was troubled for the rest of his life by trying to find a solution to Christian complicity with white supremacy and the Nazis as well. I think he was troubled by that. The other, this is really, because for me, he's like that white friend who almost completely gets it. He's still got some complexities in him that are problematic, but he really gets turned towards people who are marginalized with eyes to see it theologically. He had this kind of theological construct prior to coming to New York, but something lit a fire under him. So it may be that that's what the conclusion that I would come to. Without New York, there would not have been the one who writes The Church and the Jewish Question. That instead of just speaking out against an oppressive government, instead of continuing to simply just bind up the wounds of an oppressive government, the time may come for us to throw ourselves into the spokes of the wheel and take direct political action against an oppressive government.
In the book, you talk about a particular sermon series at Abyssinian about the hungry God, naked God. I wonder if you could kind of share that, because that's a text I think a lot of Christians today think of, the Matthew 25 text. But what was it like to hear that for Dietrich, where he's all of a sudden, attending church, recognizing that the teachings of Jesus are about the material existence and the nature of what it means to be human and human in community, and this type of thing. Like the way you describe it, it's kind of like he had built this wonderful machine and no one had ever told him if you put a battery in it, it comes alive. And then all of a sudden, like the battery goes in, it's like, oh, this is cool. The Legos can move,
Yeah. Yeah. So it's 1930. The Great Depression is ravishing New York. And as the saying goes, when white America gets a cold, black America gets pneumonia. So we can see right now in the midst of COVID-19, it is slamming black communities. Well, Adam Clayton Powell is driving in Harlem in his really nice car that the church has purchased for him. The church was a very wealthy church. There are members of Abyssinian who didn't even feel the Great Depression. So they bought their pastor this really nice car. He's driving along and he sees people ravaged by the financial situation. He says, God, why don't you do something? He says later he's asleep and he hears in a dream, Adam, why don't you do something? And as a good pastor does, he takes it as a call to preach a sermon series. So in this sermon series, which he picks up from Matthew 25, as you identified, I was naked and you clothed me. I was a stranger, you invited me, and I was hungry, you fed me. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. And he preaches those two, the naked God and the hungry God. At the time of writing that book, I looked everywhere I could for excerpts of that sermon. It wasn't until after the book was published that I found an excerpt of the sermon, Hungry God. And Powell says in that sermon that we feed God when we feed our sisters and our brothers. That the gospel calls us to pay attention to the material needs of people that we are in contact with. Now that would have resonated with Bonhoeffer, who understands Christ as our vicarious representative. That Christ stands in for us before God and before our neighbor. That will have meant something to him. And his emphasis on materiality that he already had with him is met in the engagement that Black Christians are having with the gospel, where they're saying that this is not just something abstract, that discipleship literally means love your neighbor. It means that you're to pay attention to the concrete material needs of people who are right in front of you. This is the development of a Christianity, one might say, from a people who understood salvation in terms of material embodied realities. What does salvation mean for a people who can't say that they actually own their bodies? What does salvation mean to a people, for someone who doesn't know where the next meal is coming from? This places it in concrete material terms. And he's hearing that spoken in Abyssinian.
In particular, one of the things you talk about that I think a background might help is just what the Harlem Renaissance meant to culture at large, and how the depiction of you talk about the way it resists that kind of Eurocentric ideal picture of the human, and it resists a lot of dominant white culture depictions of what Black life in America looks like, and that even that Bonhoeffer brought back different particular things with him from Germany to Germany from his time there. So if you're not too familiar with the Harlem Renaissance, what kind of how would you describe that art scene, that community, and what it would be like to show up as a German and encounter it?
Yeah, so I just wrote this piece. It's under review right now. It's talking about this particular moment that we're in light of George Floyd. Race is really a regime of representation, okay? And that representation happens aesthetically. It's in art, literature, music, so forth, morality, religion. It's this regime of representation that Africans were co-opted into and placed in a subordinate role, like the anchor holding the entire boat afloat, as it were. And the boat is Western anthropology, what's really whiteness and white supremacy in general. So in this regime of representation, the moment the period of the Harlem Renaissance is an interruption in the representation. So Black people have been depicted in certain kind of ways in order to stabilize a way of seeing the world that comes from white racist folks all the way since slavery. Black people are representing Black people, and they're doing it in multiple ways. Now, there are a lot of artists who are depicting Jesus, because to interrupt the regime of representation, you have to address the fetish, as it were, the template, the main figure that they model themselves after, the savior of the world. So the Christ that Bonhoeffer encounters aesthetically in Harlem, coming into the Harlem Renaissance, is Black. Why are they doing that? They're not pulling him to the margins, just pulling him to the margins in a society that's pushed Black people to the margins after creating them. They create Black in this regime. This is something very different. It's just a whole different way of understanding human being. Does that make sense? So it's another way of saying it, as I stated earlier, it's just interrupting it's an interruption in the way that white people have ordered the world. It's doing it aesthetically. That's what the Harlem Renaissance is. It's Black people speaking about Black people for Black people, both and creating culture in that way. But it's got this political voice to it. It's an interruption. Who is Jesus if he's not the white representative of the savior of the world? The savior of the world is also a colonial project. Give them civilization, give them culture, and save their souls and save their humanity, as it were, by making them as human as possible, which is as Western as possible. Yeah, so Bonhoeffer has a Christ-centered theology. But it's interesting to come from Europe, with a Christ-centered theology. What does that mean when your Jesus is white and a product of the colonial project? Imperial Jesus is a representative of the imperial structure of the West. But he goes into Abyssinian, and they also are speaking of Christ-centeredness. For Abyssinian to speak of Christ-centeredness is not to speak about the colonial Christ, not to speak of the Jesus of empire, but to speak of the one who suffers with us. And if he's with God, if God is with Jesus on the cross on Friday, then God is with us on the cross in the United States, and Sunday is coming. This is not the Jesus risen with all power. This is the Jesus hidden in suffering and shame.
Would you say that the kind of the theology of the cross in the Black church helped him rethink or rework his Lutheran theology of the cross?
I think he would have recognized it.
Mm-hmm.
I think these further developments in the theology of the cross for him would have come as a result of witnessing Jesus in the community of people who put their entire selves under the gospel.
One of the things that strikes me, especially in thinking about our kind of current moment and then his own kind of coming alive when you enter the body of Christ at a different disposition of power, is like how much of the American church, the white part of the American church, doesn't just have to be Christocentric in the sense of finding God where God's revealed God's self, like Barth or Bonhoeffer or anyone like that. But it seems that Barth or Bonhoeffer recognized the situation of revelation isn't just the individual Christ, but it's also the location in which it's encountered. And so James Cone makes a similar modification, right, to that. The fight going on between Tillich and Barth about revelation is that the context matters on both ends. That yes. Jesus was crucified and lynched, and those power dynamics matter on the ground where you're reading the text. And right. I wonder if Bonhoeffer's learning or something like that can help us think through, especially people of privilege in this context, that there's elements and some of the passion and things of the gospel that are just not encountered if you only hear it read and interpreted from places of privilege.
Right. We would say social location matters.
Mm-hmm.
So social location matters, and that the gospel itself is dynamic. That Christ standing in for my sister and brother is happening in this moment, in this encounter. So you can't determine your faithfulness to Christ in a predetermined way. You're not going to come to a set of principles or rules and give yourself to them and therefore call yourself Christian. Because that's not life. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Life encounters you on a daily dynamic basis. So the question for us is not, what must I believe in order to be faithful to Christ, but what is God's will for me today? That's Bonhoeffer. And what is God's will for me in relationship to this sister or brother? I don't know, Jeffrey, you have anything you might want to add about that?
I'm thinking about some of the spaces in your book where you make the connection between Bonhoeffer's move to suffering. And so I don't have it right in front of me, but I have the quote, Christianity became concrete and visible from the perspective of suffering. And from the perspective of suffering, Bonhoeffer saw that Christians must be different from people who do not have the commandments of Christ. So there was a sense in which, for me, when Bonhoeffer comes to the end, the letters, papers from prison, he's saying only the suffering God can help.
Yeah.
I'm hearing Abyssinian Baptist Church.
Yeah.
I'm not hearing the kind of constructs of European theology. I'm not hearing the kinds of voices even that Bonhoeffer is using in Sanctorum Communio. I'm hearing a whole nother depth of what this is. And you have some really great analysis in your book that I think is extraordinarily timely for the time that we're living in now. And I keep thinking to myself, what does Bonhoeffer say to us in this moment where we're standing potentially in a kairotic moment where significant things could change?
Right.
Even to the very understanding that entire narratives of race that people, you said something in the first part about Bonhoeffer was like that white friend that almost gets it.
Right.
And then I was thinking about what you said there in connection to the kind of analysis that you lay out in your book. And I was like, well, if Bonhoeffer got that, then I think he got a whole lot of it.
Yeah.
And was more than almost. But I want to just read, if you don't mind, everybody hates to have their own words read back to them, I suppose. But you say the white Christ was the theological muscle of the power structure of the color line and its global manifestations: colonization, imperialism, nationalism, and white terrorism in America.
Yes.
And I think that line is laden with a kind of analysis that if you will go ahead and accept that, then you have a key to unlocking a gazillion structures right now that are operative in not just American society, but certainly in American society, that are keeping us from the beloved community.
Yes.
Sorry, I kind of went off on a tangent there, but
that's helpful. Thank you.
I was thinking about the analysis that you raise and the connections that you raise in your text, and really wondering about would be extraordinarily helpful for now, and how does the church engage in that task where we all become transformed, one way or the other.
Yeah. Thank you. That portion that you read, I was heading into description, is something that happens. Bonhoeffer spends Christmas in Cuba during his time in 1930-31 in the United States. Cuba's very black. Now, it's also a former colony of the Spanish. So, as colonial theorists will tell you, post-colonial, decolonial theorists will tell you that racism exists anywhere colonialism lingers or has left a mark. He heads into the South in order to get to Cuba, and going along through the South, and then being in Cuba, and where they've got this German school set up there in Cuba that he spends his time at. He can't help but witness, he can't help but see what's happening there in Cuba as well, in addition to his trip through the South. Colonialism and Southern segregation, both structured by a theological informant. This is the white Christ. Those are pieces that you cannot help but miss. Eugene Genovese, in some of his magisterial work on slavery, says that the Southerners went from defending themselves in the practice of slavery to explaining the way the world works to the rest of the world in light of slavery. That this is the way the world works. This is God's orders of creation, which was a phrase that was important to the Nazis as well. And they're doing this in a very biblical literalist in society, that white Christ is not just, like French Jesus. This is not like just Spanish Jesus. This is a Jesus that represents the anthropological structures set in place by the practice of buying and selling Africans. That white is something altogether different. This is the apotheosis of the human here. And so right now in the moment that we're living, this context that we're living, the closer one's humanity is aesthetically to this template, white, the more deference you are given in society. Black is the furthest from this idealized figure. So you might say that white Christ, as I said earlier, is the representation of power. The resurrection is risen with power. And when I do a lecture on this at times, I show this painting of the resurrection by a man named Karl Bloch. He comes out of the tomb looking like Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. He's got clothes on, however. He looks like Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, his hair and his arms outstretched and so forth. And he's got two white, blonde, angelic beings kneeling at his feet. And the stone didn't get rolled away. The stone comes slamming down on his enemies, and there's blood in front of him. Happy Easter. It's this, he's crushed his enemies in this blood, and he's risen with power. That's a very good representation of the militarism, the power socially, and the patriarchy as well. All of this of the white Christ. Contrast that with, I cannot find the author, the artist, the name of the artist of one of my favorite depictions of Christ. And it's really the belly of a slave ship. Mm. There are arms and legs, and a head coming off of the body that represents humans crammed in tight quarters crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Mm. The brokenness there, the forced remaking of humanity, or Palmer Hayden's depiction of Jesus and the Three Marys. Their bodies are disproportionate. They're not perfectly proportioned human beings like Karl Bloch's risen with all power. Their hands are disproportionately large. Their feet are disproportionately large. The features are different. There are black women standing at the cross and weeping, and one kneeling at his feet weeping. But he's on the cross, and he's dark. That's really what this society has done to people of color. Combs said that the actual representation of this Christ risen with all power is not Jesus on a cross outside of Jerusalem, but people of color, we may say black people, on a cross in an effort to ritually cleanse white space of its impurities. Mm. Now, this is where I feel it's so important to understand in drawing from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. They were structuring society around the concept of the Aryan. It is an overtly racial state. There is no way to miss that and do this work with Bonhoeffer. He's responding to a government that is structuring itself according to a racial ideal, the template of a human being. How do we read him in light of that effort by his government, this pastor and theologian?
Mm-hmm. And that's why, one of the things you were talking about earlier is what attracted me to him early in my life was the fact that he got it right out of the gate. And I think the way you just laid it out is he understood the broader implications of of how a particular human was being narrated in his society.
Yeah.
That made even somebody like his brother-in-law less than human.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So true. He struggled. He struggled when asked to preach that funeral, and regretted it for the rest of his life. But
boy, did he.
Yeah. This is it's really something. So Hitler highlighted the ideal, loved the ideal, and talked about it in terms of the ideal, and the Jew with their erstwhile materialist republic. You know, the Jew is material. And Bonhoeffer says that the ideal is a problem. That it is precisely in the concrete and in the embodied, because he had already done the work to talk about a social understanding of human being, which becomes all the more important now that he's actually attending church. His faith is important to him. I should say this though too. Historically, Bonhoeffer scholars would have placed his turn towards the Sermon on the Mount, placed emphasis, or I should say the impetus of his turn towards the Sermon on the Mount, primarily with the French pastor that he was at Union alongside, Jean Lasserre. And that's important. Jean Lasserre was hugely important to Bonhoeffer's turn towards embracing the Sermon on the Mount. But you have to, I would strongly urge that you got to read his turn towards the Sermon on the Mount in light of the conversation he's having with Harlem Renaissance and Abyssinian. That he's reading the Sermon on the Mount through the lenses of people who see Christ in the context of suffering. You have to have both of those together, because when you read discipleship, that's pretty much what he's talking about. It's the suffering Christ. The only one thing I would say and challenge about that read for Bonhoeffer is that for him, the majority of his talk about identifying with Christ and suffering comes from the ability to choose that. And maybe that's because he's speaking in context to a group who are non-Jewish Germans who may choose to turn a blind eye, or identify with their suffering Jewish neighbor. Reading that today, it's for those of us who have no choice in suffering, may find that challenging to gain a theological ethic from him, this ethic of renunciation. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that can be laid at the foot of Bonhoeffer, that in fact he's making better victims. If you valorize suffering too much to the extent, then at what point do you cross over into the realm of passiveness and of saying that order is the God that we're going to serve?
Yeah.
Which
right.
is now what the white Jesus is calling forth in a lot of different segments. Right now is order. So
right.
Yeah,
law and order, people.
Yeah.
Right.
But there is a certain, and you can even say, and I do say this, that Bonhoeffer is writing about suffering so strongly because it's a projection of his own circumstance when he's in prison. If you had not have known all that had preceded him being put into prison, I think once you sort of have a sense of what precedes him being in jail, then you do see, like you said, the suffering is the thing that was chosen. And not everybody has that freedom. For some, suffering is imposed.
Right.
Yeah.
But there's an interesting identification with suffering people that happens for him while he's in prison, though, too. Now it's being imposed upon him, though he does choose to stay in prison, but he's a helpless victim. You may recall the poem Night Voices. This poem is fascinating. Let me just Trip. Can I read a little bit of this poem?
Definitely, I support poem reading.
Okay, you support poem reading. All right. He begins with a narration of where he's at. The poem. It's a long poem. Stretched out on my cot, I stare at the gray wall. Outside, a summer evening that knows me not. Sings and descends over the land quietly. The day's tide ebbs on an eternal shore. Sleep a while. Gather strength in body and soul, head and hand, outside, nations, houses, spirits, and hearts are in flames until the blood-red night is past and your day breaks stand fast. Let me give you a little bit of background as to what's happening here. The first few days that he's in prison, they don't know who he is. He's thrown into a cell with a blanket that is so putrid that he would rather freeze than wrap his body with that very gross thing. His bread is thrown into the cell. And then after 24 hours, he's taken to a cell that is on a block for the most dangerous, you might say. I don't know if dangerous is the right word. People who are condemned. He's placed in a cell for the condemned. The only person the only people who are able to visit him, who are able to come into the cell, is the person to change the bucket in the corner that is his latrine. Okay, they place a sign outside saying that nobody is to speak to him. All right. He is utterly alone and not sure if he's going to survive. He doesn't even have the charges read against him. That's his situation there in prison. Now, it's helpful at this point, and this is this is in a lecture I did in a plenary session just recently in the Bonhoeffer Congress in South Africa, to ask the question not who killed Bonhoeffer, but what killed him. What is it that killed him there? We know there was the Nazis, but the Nazis were after something too. The Nazis were after a thing that structured humanity according to whites only power structures in the United States as well that he saw. As Du Bois says, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the very same problem we have today as well in various places of the world where colonialism has lingered or left a mark. So he's in prison as a result of this what question that's killed him. And now he's identifying with this community of people. Listen to this. Here is not a person, but this is a community that he now is identifying with. Mute is their chorus. They're not listened to. Wide open my ear. We the old, we the young, we the sons of every tongue, we the strong, we the weak, we the watchful, we who sleep, we the rich and we the poor, all alike in calamity's hour. By the way, Bonhoeffer was fairly wealthy. We the bad, we the good, wheresoever we have stood, we whose blood was often shed, we witnesses of the dead, we the defiant and we the resigned, we the innocent and we the maligned, tormented by long loneliness in heart and mind. Brother, searching and calling are we. Brother, can you hear me? Fascinating what's happening in this poem. He says and does quite a bit more in this fascinating poem, Night Voices, where he's even wrestling with the people who have had him live a duplicitous life. and that duplicitous life was having to be covert in an overtly racist killing regime. A couple of questions here. Steve London is asking, what did I mean by he chose to stay in prison? And then Alyssa Mitchell asks, who is the author? The author of that poem that I was just reading was Bonhoeffer himself. He wrote that in prison. Night voices, voices he's hearing in the darkness. The other question about he chose to stay in prison, there was a possible escape plan that was hatched. In the end, he feared what would happen to his family and friends should he escape.
Yeah, you were talking about when he first arrived. Later on, they found out who he was, and his situation improved considerably.
It was embarrassing for him.
Yeah, he was. He was kind of embarrassed, and then he made that friends with Knobloch, I guess, one of the guards named Knobloch, and
yeah,
he was able to get privileges that the other prisoners just weren't able to get. But Tripp had a great question. It's on my mind too.
Yeah. So the question, I'm sorry, Tripp.
Just what were the suspicions? Like Dietrich Bonhoeffer recognized what's going on early, right? And so in Germany, and I think that one of the things we can learn if we're stuck in our homes, and then the violence of white supremacy comes on the TV screen in new ways. And different parts of the media actually allow it to be voiced in ways it hasn't before, is not just to recognize the violence and suffering that's there, but to in that time cultivate a hermeneutics of suspicion towards power that doesn't just see this one moment and go, that's murder, that's wrong, but recognizes that part of identifying with the cross-dead Jewish first century prophetic resistor is to cultivate the questions that puts you in that position. And I wonder how Bonhoeffer cultivated, and then what kind of questions and sensitivities and awareness should the church have? Because for too long, the American church thought we succeeded if our pastor played golf with Pharaoh rather than telling him to let the people go. Yeah. And so what does it mean to kind of deconstruct white supremacy, colonialism, imperialism with a cruciform hermeneutic?
Yeah. That's a really good question. So let's start. We can start by going backwards with what you had begun the question with, and what were the questions that he was able to, I guess, see through early on? What were these? What were the lenses that enabled him to see what the others were not able to see? If I'm understanding you correctly, right? Okay, some of the questions on the front. Let's deal with the big ones, kind of the low-hanging fruit right away. Christians should be concerned about Jews. The church struggle begins with a young reformers movement, and then it becomes Pastors Emergency League. And at the point of the Pastors Emergency League, Bonhoeffer is involved with it. When it becomes the Confessing Church, he's in England. Okay. He leaves during the Pastors Emergency League because he writes a confession. He co-authors the Bethel Confession in this Pastors Emergency League. And in this Bethel Confession, he includes that Christians should pay attention to the Jewish question. Now, this is a matter for him. This has to do with the content of our faith. It's hearkening back to an argument among earlier Lutherans about things that are indifferent, things we should be indifferent about, the adiaphora controversy. Is the Jewish question a matter of things indifferent, or does it relate to the actual preaching of the gospel? So for Bonhoeffer, it's not adiaphora. This is a matter of the gospel, of the preaching of the gospel. It's not simply a government issue, which is the church's left hand, God's left hand, and the people who administer the gospel, the church, are God's right hand. This is a matter of the church itself. And how so? Because they've been told that Jews should be kicked out of the church. This is the government moving into spaces that it should not be. And Oregon, and telling the church how it's to live its life. And it was doing it specifically based on anti-Semitism. Bonhoeffer is hearing the resonances. He's seeing the racism. He's naming the racism. Also, he does, as he does in discipleship, organizing society according to race. This raises racism and national structures of racism to a matter of the gospel being preached. And I would connect this. This is important. I know this is kind of a longish answer, but I would connect this to a catechism that he writes weeks after he returns from New York. He writes his catechism with a Jewish friend, Franz Hildebrand. And in the catechism, he says, although it may be uncomfortable, here I'm paraphrasing because I don't have it exactly in front of me, may be uncomfortable for the Christian, the time may come when the Christian must act politically on behalf of your sister or brother, for the sake of love. This is one. He also calls ethnic pride a sin against the Holy Spirit, the unpardonable sin. Now, you've got this ethnic pride for Aryanism, for the Aryan, for the folk. That's like the foundation for Aryan, for the hope for the Aryan. And now the government, the political structure, is targeting your sister or your brother. It is a part of the Christian faith to speak about that. That's not adiaphora. He sees that very early on. And I connect that. I think it's important to see that he's writing about that right when he gets back from New York. That's an imported good.
I wonder if the question of one, I would briefly say what the adiaphora controversy is like when you decide what is essential to the faith or not, right? Like, and right. So right. You can we have unity in essentials, but then how many points of Calvinism do you want to have, or whatever, these type right. of things. And would you say that one of the challenges American Christianity constantly has is what is essential about our identity as Christians when you can have commitments there that conflict with our identity as members of free market economy, members of an imperial nation state, and these type of things? Like, what are those elements that when, especially if you're a person of privilege, you want to label adiaphora, because then there's no demand for Christ on you. It's just let's just be nice and have a multiplicity of answers.
Right. This is a serious problem here in the States. I teach a course on the mission of the church. And you'd be surprised at the variance in a classroom of 20 people, 20 Christians, on what the church should be about doing in the world. Is the church a lifeboat in the midst of the world that's a sinking ship? This is an old model for a mission of the church. The church then is just about preaching the gospel and saving eternal souls. You don't say anything about political systems or structures. The concern is about whether they're going to hell. Turns the gospel into fire insurance. Okay. Martin Luther King Jr. said the church is not a thermometer simply registering the temperature of society, but it's a thermostat. It should be changing the temperature of society for people who are left in the cold. I paraphrase him with that a bit. And there are other models of the church that see the church as simply being a witness to a society that is speaking a different language. And in this community of the faith, we speak the language of the gospel, and we witness to the world by our love for one another and the life that we live with each other. I think that last one makes for some schizophrenic Christians, because you don't have a location that's completely outside of the political structures where you live. You are still a part of or inside of the political system and structure that is kicking people's butts. So what does the church do in the world that you are a part of as a contributing member? This is the question for Christians. And if it doesn't include love your neighbor in a very concrete way, whether they are Christian or not, this is plain for people whose bodies have them targets of a political system that is made for whites only. This is plain for us. You got to pay attention to the fact that I'm getting my butt kicked and people like me are dying at the hands of political systems across this country and the Western world here. For you to say that the gospel is not political means that you don't give a damn about my life. And that's not Christian. That ain't Christian.
So, Reggie, you have a really profound part in your book. I read a little bit of it. Lynching was a method of terrorism, and terror was a proven instrument wielded by the keepers of structural and systematic white supremacy to police the borders of privilege. Whites used terrorism to condition blacks to avoid white segregated spaces and to give way to the claims of white ascendancy in regards to all matters related to heaven and earth.
Yeah.
And there's a certain sense then in which I think we're coming the full force of the policing of boundaries through terrorism.
Yeah.
is now undeniable in front of white America.
Yeah.
I mean, it should have always been, but it's becoming increasingly impossible for white America, white Christians to say, if they just did what they were asked,
right.
If they do what they're asked, they're still going to get killed, because terrorism is terrorism. If it's state-sponsored terrorism, or terror is terror. Yeah. And when the state uses it to enforce certain boundaries about where you can go, what stores you can enter into, the kind of spaces that you inhabit, I think that that's the point where it's maddening for some people, I guess, to see the obviousness of it, and it totally escapes others.
Yeah.
I mean, and I guess that's the part where I'm feeling schizophrenic myself right now, because I see all of the masses of people in the streets, and I didn't think we had it in us.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking maybe I want to get a little hopeful here, I mean, maybe this is a kairotic moment, and it's going to be more than just window dressing. And then I keep thinking, well, when have we ever not fallen back into the patterns of our comfortableness with white supremacy?
Yeah. Yeah. So, in his classic text, Jesus and the Disinherited, Howard Thurman talks about 3 hounds that have dogged the disinherited throughout history, and that Jesus was familiar with them as a poor Palestinian Jew in the context of a colonized state. Fear, deception, and hatred. These hounds dog the disinherited. Now, terrorism is an act of fear. Fear conditions within the heart of the disinherited a way of seeing society and themselves in it. Fear tells them, the disinherited, something about their worth. White folks in the midst of Jim Crow could move in and out of spaces wherever they wanted with impunity. But Black folks knew to stay in to stay in your place. You do not go into that white neighborhood. You don't take the front door, you take the back door. You don't sit in the first rows on the bus, so forth. And there is a message that's internalized about your value. In that text, Thurman says one way to combat fear is to recognize that you are a child of God. This is one of the responses. So recovering a sense of value for yourself is a way of engaging the practices of fear that work to rearrange your whole being. So it's not white people that control all things related to heaven and earth. When I come to the recognition that their fears would try, I should say, fear that they have, or actually fear that they would try and impose on me as an organizing mechanism, is a lie. But it's also saying something about the people who would impose the fear. That fear that's imposed is fear that white people have of Black humanity. This is one of the things that people in looking at the Harlem Renaissance would say, that the Harlem Renaissance was a failure. Why? Because it didn't change society. They had hoped that white people would see that Black people are in fact human and can create culture and civilization like white people did, and that they would welcome us. Well, no, that's not what happened. That white people recognizing that the narrative of Black space in society isn't true. So white supremacy has to adapt because it's always trying to maintain white as ascendant. This is how they turned President Obama's run for office into an equal opportunity job employment. It's still trying to adapt for this Black person who escapes the structures that white supremacy has set up ideologically for Black people. You breaking out of these narratives because we're not what white people say we are. That speaks of fear on the practice on the other side, not just in the act of terrorism. It's fear in the people who would enact terror. So I can't recall what we were talking about. I just went on a tangent there.
That's all right. That's great. I might be having to leave the conversation in a minute, but before we go, I do want you to say a few words about, you make a point in significant ways about Bonhoeffer's capacity for empathy.
Mm.
And, you say it's not just that he is gaining some kind of analytical lens with which to view the world differently, but that there is a kind of empathic response that he has to the conditions that he's in. He has it when he's working with the youth group in Berlin, the confirmation class. He has it when he's thinking about that career working in the most oppressed areas of Berlin suburbs and stuff. He has it when he's in Harlem. Yeah. So tell me a little bit, or tell people who are listening maybe, about that capacity for empathy.
It's an interesting thing about this, and I didn't say this in the book. His father, is a psychotherapist, head of the Charité Hospital in Berlin. He doesn't like psychotherapy, and he probably would not have used the word empathy. In fact, I don't think he liked that language at all. He's got some daddy issues around psychology. Okay, but what he does do is he recognizes the limits of our ability to reason. I am not going to know you or what you think about things before you tell me. That means that I've got to listen. I need to hear from you what you need. That places me in that gives me the capacity then to see the world from your perspective. because it comes from you. To be able to see and imagine your experience that's the language of empathy, really. Being able to step into someone else's shoes. This is the man who taught me about Bonhoeffer initially was doing this word study with Bonhoeffer's the kind of core of Bonhoeffer's theology, Stellvertretung, vicarious representation. And for him, Stelle and Eintreten had us stepping and entering into someone else's context. That's the practice of empathy. So in Harlem, he goes into that location, listening to gain what he could by seeing the world from their perspective, from an other's perspective. When he's dealing with children, he tells that wonderful story when he is in Barcelona before he heads to New York. He's got this kind of this effort about him already. When he's before New York, he's this associate pastor, and a kid comes to him. I want to say the kid's 5 years old. I can't remember the story. I can't remember how old the kid was. Remember the story? The kid who lost a dog, whose dog dies. So the kid comes to him, and he's just ripped up, and he's crying. His dog has died. He's 5 years old. Dog has died. And then the kid looks up and says, "Pastor Bonhoeffer, will I ever see my doggy again?" And Bonhoeffer says, in a moment of just being with this kid, I'm sure God will make a way for us to see people we love again some way, somehow. He says, "Don't show Father this letter." But it's a moment of just feeling with this kid. He didn't give a theological response about the existence of souls in non-human beings and so forth and things. He's trying to respond based on what this person needs after it's a feeling with him. This was a kind of people who knew him say this was a natural thing for him, but it also has this theological relevance to it. That's a part of his understanding of God standing in for the other, God in Christ in the other. And our ability to love Christ means saying yes to the needs that we recognize in another instead of no, which would be no to Jesus in Jesus's commands on my life or requirements on my life. Mm-hmm. I know you got to go, man. This is your anniversary.
I know you don't want to. We don't need to get in trouble. You got to unmute yourself, Jeff.
It's hard for me to pull away. I'm enjoying this too much, but I am going to leave in about 5-10 minutes.
Okay.
All right. So
I'll just disappear, and then Tripp and I are going to do this again tomorrow at 5.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
We're reading ethics, the section on ethics as formation for tomorrow. So
yeah, the very end of that one is one of those. Oh, my friend, you almost got it, but see, then you said this. Yeah, you'll see what I'm talking. You know what I'm talking about, Jeff.
Yes.
Yeah. We're also going to read the first section in Christ, Reality, and Good.
Okay. Yeah.
So there are 3 questions that got sent in early that multiple people hit like on.
Okay.
And one of them, someone even reposted in here. So I want to ask those. Oh, well, now someone wants to know what it is that he missed. So you can do let's do that first, because the other 3 are much more broad questions. So if you're helping people cultivate a charitable hermeneutics of suspicion, where you can even read someone that you're gaining wisdom from while also recognizing the ways in which they're stuck in their own context and situation, have yet to fully recognize things. What is this that Bonhoeffer missed in the ethics section?
Okay, well, I put this in an essay for a Oxford companion to Bonhoeffer, and the first part of it just as an introduction to him. I'll say this by way of introduction to what I'm going to say. A literary scholar in Jerusalem told me this, that the divisions that we see in society between the conservative and the progressive are most often not just external to the selves who make up that political republic, but they're also mapped onto our being often, so that we are often the self against the self as well. This describes us. I would say that Bonhoeffer is a very clear depiction of the self against the self. He sees, as he says in After 10 Years in 1942, that we've got to see society from the perspective of suffering, perspective of the outcast, the downtrodden, and so forth. Why? Not because we go looking for suffering. We're not going to go and harm ourselves so that we can have better insight. You see society, you see the faithfulness of your society from the perspective of people who are suffering within it, not from the perspective of people who are doing well in that society. Okay, and structured for them. That's harmful. You got people who are harmed in it. Okay, yet, so that's hold that on one hand. On the other hand, the Christianity that he is made from in Germany, the Christianity of his colleagues, is insufficient for the problem that it's facing at that moment in Nazi Germany, the most significant problem that he would have encountered in his lifetime. It's insufficient for it. He goes grabbing for lots of different sources. In New York, he's trying for it, doesn't find it specifically there in terms of tools to reform. He reaches out to Gandhi, but didn't go there before he takes the school in Finkenwald, Zingst in Finkenwald, the confessing church, the seminary, the confessing church. He's trying to reform what Susanna Heschel called the Aryan Christ. You can't reform that figure. That figure needs to die. And because of his efforts at reforming a colonial Aryan Christ, I would say, man, you're almost there. You know that this thing has problems, but your efforts to save it, to reform it, aren't going to work. And that's in his efforts at reforming it, he still places the physical manifestation of this Christ who saves the world as the Western world. Mm-hmm. This is an imperial colonial project. Okay, so the larger picture of where Christ is represented in the world for Bonhoeffer is the West. It's Western civilization. That's the presence of Christ in the world. And for those of us with ancestry in sub-Saharan Africa, the global South, I would say, nah, nah. I'm just not on board with the colonial project. While at the same time, this pious German Christian pastor recognizes that we have to have an I-thou structure of our discipleship, not an I-it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, dear brother. Really good to see you again. I'm so glad you're doing better.
Yeah, good to see you, buddy.
Okay.
See you tomorrow, Jeff. All right, so the three last questions. One is, and this got phrased a number of ways, but then whoever anonymous attendee is here, I'm guessing it's the same person that emailed this to me. How do we do a better job at exposing the more subtle and nuanced forms of racism in our society today?
The more subtle and nuanced. It sounds like how do we recognize racism when we see it? Mm-hmm. I saw something the other day that I thought was really helpful in talking about this. Treat it like coronavirus. First of all, just expect that everybody's got it and do what you need to do to expose it or to live in light of that. I would say this in response to, that's a really helpful analogy. It's also true that everybody does have it. If we think of white supremacy I say white supremacy and racism interchangeably. They're both describing the same phenomenon. If we think of racism as a matter of the heart, of simply people with dislike or negative affect towards people of different races, then we will miss what's happening. That's prejudice. That's not racism. Racism is the manufacture and the maintenance of systems and structures for whites only. You need the anthropology of human difference that we describe as race in order to have racism. It was developed as a racist practice. What do I mean by that? Well, they weren't black. They were Mandinka. They were Yoruba. They were Mende. They were Iwe. They encounter Europeans. They pass through the door of no return onto boats and become black. Their identity is placed on their skin and are the anchor in a hierarchy of human beings. They were not black. That is a whole refashioning of being in the process of a Western world being assembled for whites only. Okay, now, you know when you're a kid, you ever have one of those outdoor pools where you walk in a circle and you create a tide and you like turn around, you try and walk against it. It's like, wow, this is really strong. Think of ideology then as that tide of thought that we've been walking in one direction for centuries. Since 1619 to 1865, it was legal to buy and sell black people in the on this soil. And in the Western world in general, I mean, the British got rid of slavery in 1808, but in the United States took a bloody war, 1865. From 1865 really until 1963, there were overt race laws on the books. The tide is still going strong in that direction. Nixon devises the Southern strategy, capitalizing on Southern anger over their party's participation in the Civil Rights Movement in 1968, and switches parties over that. I mean, the party switched from the Democrats become a progressive party, and the Republicans become a party of the former Dixiecrats in 68. Southern strategy. Barack Obama defeats the Southern strategy in 2008, but doesn't eradicate the ideology. Can't do it. It's a strong tide of thought. When you make an effort to turn and walk against it, it can wash right over that. We have to be able to, this is something Bonhoeffer said about the Bible, read the Bible against ourselves. What would it mean for us to read anthropology or being against ourselves? One way to do that, for what the Harlem Renaissance was doing, black people were saying, I'm not what white supremacy says I am. You having to take a look at it. What about for white people to take a look at the way white supremacy structures or racism has structured white identity as ascendant, as top of the food chain, so to speak? It's not just the subtle things. This is a broad, this is an anthropology here, a full-on anthropology.
Yeah, the question of anthropology, I think, shapes so many parts of basically all the other doctrines. Like one of the things that Bonhoeffer even brings up in parts of Letters and Papers is where he's like, most of the people in our culture don't believe in eternal afterlife anyway. So if the only thing we have to talk to them about is getting saved for an individual to go to heaven, then what are we going to do, right? So like part of this, like so many of our assumptions, if our anthropology is you have some like immortal soul in you that's going to heaven, that like simultaneously is a logic of oppression for physical bodies in the present. It also is the means by which you attend to the individual and not the communal or the social and the structural, right? Like, and all that's so like tied up. And one of the questions that came from multiple people that I would love your thought is, we had a pastor who serves in a very white church and a black church pastor, all of which go, we're dealing with this time. And before any of this stuff happened, I was just bored in lockdown and decided to read Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And then 3 weeks go by, and all of a sudden, everything's changed. And I got stuck reading Cost of Discipleship, Ethics, Letters and Papers, and went, why in the world did God tie all these things up together in the same place? Because everything that's running through my mind, right, going to the pulpit, to the newspaper, to our historical experience, and both of the ministers shared like this struggle to go, like, how do you show up in a time of deep desperation for lots of people, and an opportunity where the body of Christ might be more Christ-like together if we figure out what we're doing. And they all describe this challenge differently, but I'm interested in what kind of advice you have for people leading faith communities to not let a time where the culture at large are asking big questions to help them think it through, speak theologically, prophetically, and in some sense give an invitation to a new way of being community together.
Maybe this response speaks directly to your question. I hope it does, but something just occurred to me as I'm listening to you talk about that. It's one thing to see the world responding to George Floyd's murder and be grateful for the solidarity, which I am, and I will remain that. That's the answer is not changing anything about that. As though a moment of revelation has happened simply by seeing a black man murdered on TV. When I think it's more than that. It goes without saying that it's more than that. You've got a pandemic in which people are fearful for their lives, their livelihood, and the lives and livelihood of people that they are close to. And in this moment of heightened uncertainty, to see this man die in front of a watching world here was a match lit on a powder keg. Suddenly, there is a target for the uncertainty and the anger and the fears that they have in the sense of helplessness. Somehow, people were finally able to see Black existence in the Western world by being placed in the context of uncertainty. Now you're everybody is in this situation together. Everybody is uncertain. Everybody is fearful. Everybody is dependent. And you saw that black man die like that. Now you have a sense of what it feels like to be left to the whims of political systems and structures that may or may not give a damn about you. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that there is something deeply empathic about this moment because people are in the same helpless situation. I'm seeing that. So it may be that right now folks are able to say what happens to the least of these among us, or the people least regarded among us. When I went to the grocery store, this may sound like a bird walk. When I was at the grocery store with my mask on, it occurred to me that I was relying on that 18 to 20-year-old who was in charge of the shopping carts for my own well-being, because I hope that they were supposed to have been cleaning these things, I was dependent upon this person and their ability to do their job and to care for me, to keep me from catching that virus. We are so dependent upon essential workers, people who are least regarded in society. We are tied together in a how Martin Luther King Jr. described this, in an inescapably woven together in a garment of destiny. So I'm sorry, that was a bit of a bird walk, but
no, I mean it makes sense, and I think people from a lot of different places are struck why, like the critical mass shifted so quickly. Right,
yeah.
Like yesterday, I was talking with one of our mutual friends, Adam Clark, who's a wonderful theologian. And when you have friends and we were talking for 45 minutes, and he's in this group, so I'm sure he's going to hear this story. He says, "So, Trip, like, do you have any idea why? Like, is it new news that the white state kills black people?" Right? Like what was it? Because like there was no way around it. Like y'all will take any excuse to justify it, or what? Because people in Flint are still going to have children that have mental handicaps because the water ain't fixed. So like if you were thinking that this was like the breakthrough point, right? And I don't have an answer for it. That's the thing I don't get, but because of that conversation and thinking about Bonhoeffer, I could just imagine his own experience of going like, I'm going to work with a confessing church. Then he gets disappointed, right? And then gets to the point that now he's looking to these upper middle class Germans who aren't even that religious to work together to get around to a attempt assassination attempt, and like going like,
yeah.
I don't have an answer to that, but like what? Like, how do you even hear that type of question, and how do we, and especially as people that are faith leaders, like, how do you show up in conversations where you have friends who go, "This is what did it? Come on, you could have been doing this. Could have made sense a while ago," and others that are like, hoping they get a sticker on their paper because they tweeted Black Lives Matter for the first time.
Yeah. I'm seeing Black Lives Matter so commonly today from places and people who watched Eric Garner get choked to death too, get choked out, from people who, upon hearing that Trayvon Martin weaponized the sidewalk, weren't infuriated by that. It's incredible. Sandra Bland, I had a moment of slight panic just the other day. I was working on this essay, and it had me go back and revisit Sandra Bland's death. And I looked up some information on that officer that pulled her over. And when she was pulled over, it followed the routine that he normally did. She's driving along Prairie View Avenue. It's in front of Prairie View University, where my nephew is a student. Prairie View, and it's a black college outside of Houston. She's driving in front of the university. The officer is tailgating her really hard. She thinks he's trying to get past her to go chase something, which is reasonable. So she moves out of his way. And then he pulls over for not using her taillight, for not signaling. Okay. She's thinking, what in the heck is happening here? And it ends up with her being snatched out of the car and dying in a jail. I totally could see that happening. And I remember watching the video footage that some young man had made of her saying, "Thank you for recording this." And how helpless we are against a state that has not only the guns, but the ideology to back up the guns of Black subhumanity. Okay. My wife was out. She was taking a little bit longer. She was in another part of Illinois here that's about 45 minutes away. And because I could see how real I mean, I could feel the helplessness, and I could see Sandra Bland's situation and just a moment of panic. That where's she at? Is she okay? I had the same sense when our son called us as he was being pulled over. This was a couple of years ago. He got pulled over by the cops. He saw the flashing lights behind him, and he called his mom. I'm being pulled over right now. I don't know what's going to happen. He was terrified. And the same thought went through both of our minds at the same time. I know about it because we talked about it. We thought we had more time. And the thought that we had more time was also that, in addition to teach him how to be pulled over, is this the end? Now, are those exaggerations? Some might say, yeah. What's the percentage of death of black people being killed by cops? We're not thinking percentages. We just know that it is greater for us. And the reality is that does happen. Now, in this moment with Floyd, people are somehow, because of coronavirus, able to sense helplessness. You got a nose for helplessness in this moment and recognize its relationship to race in the country, in the West, finally.
Yeah, it's and I don't think it's. I mean, I wouldn't say it's exaggerating to think that, like, my experience. No one ever explained to me how to get pulled over. I got pulled over plenty of times. I've talked back to cops from the time I was 16. And when I used to do stand up, I had a whole bit about the first time I got pulled over, and I would tell the whole joke. Everyone would laugh. And then I would say, well, I mean, of course it worked because I was white. Right. And everyone would, like, get the point, because I got indignant with a cop wasting my time because I was trying to get to a theater production. Right. And I call the head of police who goes to my church on my cell phone and hand it to the cop. And I was like, I don't know, officer so-and-so, blah, 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 blah. And I just hand it out there. And I'm like, here's this chief of police. Pick up the phone. Right. And I remember telling that when I got to the high school for my play. And one of the African-American students was like, you did what? I was like, yeah, he pulled me over. I thought he was trying to get someone else. So I'm, like, pulling out of the way. And the next thing you know, I'm cornered on the side. And I'm like, what the hell is your problem? And he's like, you said what to a cop? And I was like, it's ridiculous. Why is he going to waste his time? They're actual real murderers, you know? And this is just what came out of my mouth. And I remember then hearing stories from my friends and going like, this is nuts. So, like, it's just he probably should have told me you're being a jerk, Trip. Like, the cop should have, because I just was thinking, I'm going to be late for my play and my friends are waiting on me. Right.
Yeah.
And that's a completely normal thing any 16-year-old should get to do. If they have their sports team or their play or whatever it is they're doing their friends, and an adult interrupts them because they're trying to prove a point. Like, anyway, like, I just, it's just sad. It's just sad that it takes so much for a large portion of the body of Christ to contemplate taking that question seriously. And the last question, and someone asked it, and I don't know. I don't know a nice way of putting it. I thought I was going to figure it out. It said, like, this is from a white person. It said, this whole experience makes me wonder if Christianity is worth keeping at all. Why would a Christian ethicist who's black in 2020, when Donald Trump's parading with a Bible in front of a church after getting rid of nonviolent protesters, and you see the history of systemic racism, if you are a parent, why do you want to tell them about Christ Church, given the legacy? And if you are, like, how do you frame it?
Amen. Amen. I love the question. Frederick Douglass was a Christian. Harriet Tubman was a Christian. Nat Turner was a Christian. Frederick Douglass reading the Christian faith of white people in the United States is basically reciting Matthew 24. Hypocrites, woe to you, hypocrites. You build the tombs of the prophets. You traverse land and sea to make one convert. And when you make that convert, you turn them into twice the child of hell as yourself. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. He's reading their faith to them as a Christian. Harriet Tubman is following God's voice as she's plundering the economy of Southern slave-owning Christians, breaking laws, being disorderly, non-respectable, disruptive, uncivilized, because that is her faith. Now, Christianity that has a hard time reading the faith of Harriet Tubman is a Christianity not in touch, I would say, with the will of God in this world. So in his book, Slave Religion, Albert Rabbitoe talks about Christians who would sneak away to pray and preach quietly, hanging wet blankets in branches at times to keep the sound from getting out. They're doing this in a Christian country to keep that sound from making its way to white Christians' ears. Now, the question for many of us is, are they both praying to the same God? And one might say, yeah, there is pretty much one God. There are devils and demons, but there's a God who is on the side of justice for the outcast and marginalized and oppressed. And these folks who are worshiping in the invisible institution hear his voice, hear that God's voice. That's the tradition that I am from, where I am an ordained reverend in that community. Donald Trump's God is not one I know, except perhaps to call him out of people's bodies whenever the opportunity may present itself. But yeah, those are different deities. The question reminds me, and I'll say this, and at the end, as the end here. Question reminds me of a question that was posed to Howard Thurman when he was in what's now called Sri Lanka with a group of Christians, and a Hindu man took him for a meal and said, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "Well, I'm here with these Christians." He says, "No. What are you, black man, here with these Christians? What are you doing with these Christians? Don't you know they had a slave ship named Jesus? As a Christian, you are a traitor to the people of color around the world." And his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, was a response to that. He's not represented by Western European religion or imperial powers. He's Jewish, one. He's poor Jewish, two. He's poor Jewish in a colonized state. As a result, he knows, though, the experience of people who have historically had their backs pressed against the wall by politically oppressive regimes. That's the Jesus of our worship.
Wow. This has been powerful, thoughtful, energizing. Like, I'm looking forward to wrestling more with these questions. And do you have any closing thoughts or challenges for it? We have another, we're going to be reading Ethics and Letters and Papers in Prison. We didn't plan it recognizing the historical situation, but if you're going to spend time with Bonhoeffer in prison and reading what he was wrestling with there, is there any advice you have for us given our contemporary context?
Oh, about what from Bonhoeffer to read?
Mm-hmm.
I'd encourage you. Jeffrey he's done some, he's written some on Letters and Papers. Sit with him, go through Night Voices. The poem is a few pages in length, but sit with that poem for a little bit. I don't think there's not been enough work done looking through, just simmer with that, sit with that for a little bit in this moment, especially.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I would also say, when you're reading Letters and Papers, people usually read that as a nice Sunday school text. But if you were to recognize that he's writing this after the seminary was closed,
mm-hmm.
especially the first part of it. I mean, all of it's written after the seminary is closed, but thinking of the first part in light of the strengthening Nazi regime and Hitler's insistent on ideal humanity and community. And they're doing these political rallies in Nuremberg,
mm-hmm.
the Nazi Party rally ground, at least once a year. Okay, this text is written 3 years after the release of the Nuremberg laws. The laws at Nuremberg, the Nuremberg laws. I think that was the title of them. But the laws in 1935 for the racial laws, Nazi racial laws. This is written 3 years after that. Keeping the context here, I'm trying to emphasize keeping the context in mind of what's going on there in Germany, and read at least that first part of Letters and Papers. But I would strongly encourage, sit with Night Voices for a little bit and read that. Maybe read them together.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to hang out on the internet.
All right. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been fun.